Call this hearing back in. I will now start the questioning. I understand Dr. Sarowitz has to leave at 4 o'clock, so we will hopefully each of us will get a chance to ask some questions before you have to leave. So I will now recognize myself for 5 minutes, and we'll begin with Dr. Sarowitz. You mentioned in your testimony that most of the data available for SciSIP analysis are input-output data. Level of funding, number of graduate students, patents, et cetera, publications. And that these data offer an incomplete view of the societal value of S&T investments. So what would you suggest that we do to better characterize and measure the social outcomes of R&D?
Okay, thanks for asking that. It actually, let's see, how should I put this? My answer will reflect a diversity in perspectives here. I think we can all agree that the process, and Julia actually wrote about this wonderfully in Science magazine, that the process that leads from R&D to a particular desired social outcome, for example, more employment or better health, is extremely complex with many different inputs into the process. But I think that measuring is one way to understand things, but also very close case-based contextual analysis is another way to understand things. And my view is that the system is so complex that we're probably not going to come up with a big theory of how you can predict social outcomes from science and technology inputs. But we are going to be able to develop a number of principles that reflect our understanding of particular examples. So I think the kind of data that, and I wrote about this a little bit in my testimony, that we really need, a kind of data that we're lacking that will be very important is very granular case studies of both successes and failures in the full range of linkages from laboratory to social outcomes for a particular range of scientific priorities. And I think by doing that, we'll be able to elicit a set of general guiding principles that can help you guys distinguish between policy decisions that make sense and policy decisions that don't make sense. I guess I'm a little skeptical of the idea that we'll ever be able to actually predict with precision. But I think we can be a lot smarter about the basic set of assumptions if we can develop some really close case studies, sort of end-to-end case studies that show in great detail. Let me just quickly say, we're looking, for example, at Arizona State, we're looking at the development of the solar power industry in Arizona, because obviously we have a lot of sun there. And so it's not, one of the important inputs, of course, is R&D into the solar power industry, but there's all sorts of local dynamics from water availability, land use, obviously regulatory frameworks. All of those things are important, and they're not generalizable. So while I think we can develop a very rich case study around solar in Arizona, I don't think we should necessarily worry about a grand theory. So we should develop best practice case studies looking very closely at the full process of leading from the R&D activities themselves to the societal outcomes.
Does anyone else want to, any of the witnesses want to comment on that? Anything to add to that? If not, I think about this in your answer, Dr. Sarowitz, and I think, do we have the data available right now, or do we need to do a better job of collecting data so that we can do this kind of research? The whole generalizability of this is, when you look at almost anything that's really a social process, I always go back to my days as a political scientist in trying to put together these theories that will predict outcomes, and the struggles with doing that and trying to make political science into physics. How much can we do here when we're talking about doing the SciSIP research, and what we can really glean from the data that we have?
So let me just say there's a diversity of perspectives here, and that's good. I mean, I think it's a rich field, and it needs to bring lots of perspectives together, from the highly quantitative model-oriented to the more case-based qualitative. We need all that. I think we know a lot. I think Dr. Teich's point about the problems of communicating what we know is really important, and that thinking about how to communicate more effectively the things that we already know for your benefit is an essential part of it. And so two things need to go on simultaneously. This field is really only just beginning to kind of get its legs. Dr. Murray talked about how she's been doing it for a long time, didn't know there was a field out there. I've been doing it for a long time as well, but more or less in small groups. So Dr. Lane's efforts to create a community, it does two things. One is it does create the intellectual momentum that we're going to need to move the field forward, but it also allows us to really collect what we know and already, which I think is considerable, and present that if we can figure out how to communicate effectively. And I would be glad to talk about that a little bit too, if you'd like.
Well, let's come back. Right now, I'm going to yield back my time. I assume my time is up, and I want to yield now to recognize Dr. Ehlers for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, and I don't have any questions for you, Dr. Sarovitz, other than to note that we produced weather today that's very close to what you have back home. We did put a little moisture in the air as well, so that's a little different.
I wouldn't be dressed like this either, sir.
That's true. But I appreciate you coming. I don't have any questions for you that have not been either answered or explained already. What I would like to ask is, on the two ends of the panel, Dr. Lane, Dr. Teich, you're both quite familiar with the Congress and how it operates. Do you have any suggestions on what someone in the Congress could do to help educate our members about the importance of science policy and what it should be, what it can do, what it cannot do, and any wisdom you could give us, I think would be very helpful as we go forward on the Science Committee and try to, I hate to use the word modernize, but you know what I'm talking about, just try to get the workings of the House of Representatives and the Senate to reflect reality and what should be done about the science of science policy, and in particular what role science policy should have in guiding the Congress on the very difficult issues we have, particularly those relating to funding. So we'll start with you, Dr. Lane, and go to Dr. Teich, and also Dr. Murray, if you have any comments on that.
Well, thank you very much for that thoughtful question. I am not as wise in the ways of Congress as you, obviously, so this is very much in the spirit of a suggestion rather than dirigiste approach. One of the things that I think is most important that will get Congress to understand the value of science investments is evidence. If there is clear evidence of the impact of science investments on the 4 sets of dimensions, social, scientific, economic, and workforce, that both has a qualitative aspect, that is that there are real people affected and there are real advances that are made in the quality of life, but also quantitative. That is where you can unambiguously say there were this amount of investment led to a whole variety of different sets of outcomes, and that that tracer is clear. I think that's what gets people in Congress attention, because obviously they're serving the American taxpayer, and that's what the American taxpayer is interested in finding out.
Okay, Dr. Teich?
Yeah, I think I would turn that around a bit and point out that it's really very much up to us in the SciSip and science policy communities to communicate effectively with you in the Congress. You have so many messages coming at you from so many different directions that somehow what we need to do is to differentiate the kinds of information that we have, hopefully evidence-based, and recognizing, we have to recognize that it is not the only influence and the only thing that you have to take into account in making decisions. That decisions, I was struck by something Chairman Lipinski said about making political science into physics. I started out, I got an undergraduate degree in physics and my PhD in political science. And you know, in some respects, physics is a lot easier. You know, you can, freshman physics, you know, assume a frictionless plane. Okay, well, you can assume a frictionless plane, and it works in some respects. Assume a frictionless Congress, and, you know, you got nothing. It doesn't make any sense. So there is a, politics isn't neat. It's not, and data doesn't always trump a lot of other factors that go into decisions. We have to understand that we have to communicate within that framework, and then I think it is up to you in the policy community to make use of that. Best I could do on short notice.
If we had a frictionless Congress, things might go better. Dr. Murray, you have any wisdom to add to this?
Well, I'm not sure it's wisdom. It's certainly a thought I have, is that I think it's important for us to provide data that's meaningful. I think it's also important for us to think about studies that really show, again, sort of causal impact. So I think that there's some new work that's been funded by SciSip and in other places where we can say, look, you know, we did have a quite big shock to the system in terms of additional funding going in quite rapidly through the Recovery Act and some of the ARA spending. In other countries, there have been very big shifts in research funding allocation that have happened relatively quickly. And so I think we have a lot of opportunities to both study those things and then also to marshal that evidence. Because I think if we always go in and just say we want more for science and technology, you know, everybody has heard that, and of course we're going to say that. And so I think that coming in with evidence that says when you get these shifts both in level and distribution, real things happen, real differences in outcomes happen. I think if we can marshal that evidence in a persuasive way, then I think we can be much more informed and are much more likely to be listened to.
Okay. Well, those are very good comments. I worry a little bit about the Congress requiring a lot of evidence because, as you know, many experiments don't come out that well. And the Congress would say, you know, next time you come around, say, well, you know, you sold me on this project and nothing really good came out of it. And that's pretty hard to overcome. I really appreciate the ideas you've presented and the comments you've made today, and it's given me some new insight. But I really do think that we need more concentration on this, not only in the Congress, but among the science policy community. And I pled several times earlier on about this was, I deliberately said unlocking the future because I wanted someone in the future to write something better about science policy. And something along the line of Vannevar Bush's book, which was probably thicker than we want today, but nevertheless, he addressed a lot of issues that had to be taken into account. He himself was very concerned about the fact that Congress did not pick up on a lot of his suggestions, and particularly one creating a different version of the National Science Foundation. But yet, out of his work and his arguments, eventually, I think, was it some 10 years after he wrote the book, we did start establishing the National Science Foundation. So even though he regarded his work as a failure because the Congress didn't pick up on it, yet eventually it did happen. So I encourage the science policy community to become very active and frankly also very aggressive and addressing members of Congress. It would not hurt at all if a few people from the Science Policy Committee ran for Congress and got elected. And I just had an experience on the floor not 10, 15 minutes ago. Someone came up to me and had been present this morning at the Science Committee meeting and said, "Vern, what in the world are we going to do without you?" Because I had used my scientific knowledge in a number of statements. And I says, "Well, I think, I don't think I do that much. They'll get along, but the matter of fact is, there won't be any scientists left on the Science Committee. And it's just helpful to be on the inside, all the side discussions that are held. It's good to have someone there. So I urge you to, as I've done with every speech I've given to every engineering or scientific group, run for Congress. We need more scientists in the Congress. And incidentally, not just for the benefit of science, but most scientists are fairly clear thinkers on issues, frictionless or not. And they have a lot to contribute to the operation of the governing bodies of this country. I would actually say I probably had much more impact at the state level because I was truly a rarity there, and most state governments don't have the resources to have scientists on staff. And I had endless amounts of work to do trying to resolve things such as resolving difficulties between optometrists and ophthalmologists, or dealing with questions such as the foam insulation that was the rage for a while, pumping it into homes, and now people are sick from formaldehyde fumes from that. These are issues no one in the state legislature was equipped to deal with, and I resented all the time I had to spend on it. But at the same time, it was very useful to society. So spread the word, please, and thank you again for being here. I appreciate it very much.
Thank you, Dr. Ehlers.
Mr. Chairman, I beg your pardon, but I have a bill on the floor that's just been called up, and I have to rush down there to speak on it. So my apologies.
Mr. Ehlers, before you go, I just want to say on behalf of AAAS, science community, and the science SciSip community, we're going to miss you. So, thank you for everything that you've done.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
So, Dr. Ehlers, we'll assume I have your permission to continue here and wrap up. Seeing as there was no objection from Dr. Ehlers, I was asking for your permission to continue on and to wrap up here. Thank you. Okay, you are still here. And frictionless. I will now recognize myself for 5 minutes. It's funny, talking about the assumptions and comparing physics to, or trying to make political science into physics. I had a colleague of mine in grad school in political science who was also, like myself, had a background in engineering before going to get a PhD in political science, and he always would say that political science had physics envy, that we were trying to be physics. Now, it did not stop political scientists in even focusing specifically on Congress. Congressional scholars did not, some of them were not afraid to make assumptions that wind up where they were talking about something that was supposed to be Congress but was pretty much, very much not Congress anymore after all the assumptions that were made, and make all these assumptions that said with this, we're dealing with a imaginary legislature, but then we're going to pretend like it's Congress. Hopefully that's not the type of work that's going on here in SciSip. I want to make sure, one thing I want to ask, Dr. Murray talked about this, and I want to ask everyone about, if they have any more comments on this, because I know, Dr. Murray, in your testimony, you talk extensively about it, is training more people to be able to do this research, and having programs that produce the type of, you go into, especially talking about PhD programs, but do we need to, in general, produce people who can do this, to do this work? And I know that people who are doing this, researchers in this field, are located, as I mentioned in my opening statement, in all kinds of different places. Dr. Murray, I know you're in the business school. Are there any suggestions? I don't know if there's anything else you want to add, Dr. Murray or Dr. Tyke or Dr. Lane would want to say anything about where we are right now in terms of programs that are producing researchers that can do SciSip, where that is going. Are there programs such as this that are out there? If not, where are they coming from? Is this something that we need to, you really think we need to do more of and concentrate on such a specific field like this? Or can we get by with people coming from different fields? Is that the way to do it? So I just want to throw that question out there. As a former political scientist academic, I'm interested in questions like this in terms of what we're doing out there in higher education.
So I think that's a very interesting question. It's an important question. The main area, if you're going to train people in doing this kind of research, they're going to go into the field and develop the kind of skill sets that we need. You want them to be able to get tenure. You want there to be able to be a career ladder. And a program the size of SciSip isn't sufficient to support an interdisciplinary field in its own right. Nor is it, I think, possible to develop career paths for such a narrow set of skills. So I think what's important is to convince very smart people in economics and sociology, in psychology, and many of the other areas that the field of science policy is a really important and interesting field that they can bring their skill sets to bear on to answer important science policy questions, and that they can publish and get advance within their own disciplines. So I think that's what's critical, rather than trying to establish a separate field in its own right. I don't think that's feasible given budget constraints and so on. So that's what we've explicitly been trying to foster, to make it a intellectually challenging, exciting, and publishable type of field.
Any other comment, Dr. Murray?
Yes, so I think that there are three different constituencies for education. So one is the PhDs, who are probably the producers of research. And then there are the science and technology policy, typically master's students who tend to go into policy roles, who I think we need to educate to be both sort of consumers and also people who really understand what we do and can help do it with us. And then finally, there are probably the scientists and engineers themselves who could benefit from understanding some of this, who then become a sort of bottom-up constituency who can shape agencies and so on. I think on the PhD side, I think Julia's exactly right. I don't think that you can have a new discipline of SciSip. I think it's both too small, and in fact, one of the great values of SciSip is indeed the fact that people come from these other strong disciplinary foundations. I think what we do need to emphasize, though, is a sort of a field focus. If you think of a PhD in political science, economics, mostly there's a field. At the moment, I don't think many places really have a field focus and something that we would recognize as SciSip. And I think that we could go a long way towards funding things that would help establish that. PhD education requires, especially in something like this, significant investment in teaching materials and data sets and things so that students can work on this, and that we could effectively collaborate across a set of schools to really begin to develop materials, share expertise, and then potentially bring the PhD students together as a community so that they recognize one another, even though they're always going home, and we know we're educating them to be hired by business schools, economics departments, and so on. So I think that there's an opportunity there as long as we make sure we know what we're trying to accomplish, which is not a new discipline. I think on the science and technology master's side, I'm less familiar with that because even though I do SciSip research, I don't teach in the technology and policy program at MIT. But that in and of itself tells you something, which is that there's, I think, a little bit still of a disconnect that the traditional science and technology policy programs have not necessarily sort of incorporated SciSip research into their teaching material. And so again, I think that there's an opportunity to do something about that, not to insist that people do it, but to provide opportunities to develop a really effective curriculum so that as people go into their careers as policymakers, they understand what we're trying to do, some of the methods, they know good SciSip research from less good SciSip research, and they themselves can say, oh, you know, we're doing something in our agency. We could actually run that as an experiment that could be studied. We could try 2 different ways of allocating funding, and we could really do the analysis with real data. And I think if we could educate people to that level, we'd have a much better interchange in the long run, and it would be a very vibrant community.
Here, Dr. Teich?
Yes, well, a couple of things worth noting in response. First of all, there are and have existed for some time about 25 programs in universities around the United States and some outside the U.S. in addition to those 25 that provide graduate education in science, what we have called science, engineering, and public policy, and which overlaps quite substantially with what we now call SciSip. We had, many years ago, we published a guide, old-fashioned paper-type guide. We now have a website on the AAAS website that links to all of these programs, which could help people find them. I don't see this as a discipline either, as was said a moment ago. It's my analogy is that it's more like a field of say, area studies in which, it's like Latin American studies, for example, or African studies. It is a field in which many different disciplines contribute to an understanding of what's going on in this business. So that's one thing that I wanted to mention. Another thing is that there are a lot of young people who are very interested in this, and we need to encourage them. There is an organization called International Nonprofit. It's incorporated as a 501c3 called Triple Helix Incorporated, which has about 500 students from many universities, prestigious universities around the world, which provides an opportunity for students to educate themselves about the relationships between science and society and ethics, business, and law. They actually publish an undergraduate journal, which AAAS, a couple of people from AAAS's staff serve on their board of advisors. They also have a poster session at the AAAS annual meeting. And then there's a group called the Science and Technology, or S&T Global Consortium, which is an association of graduate students and these programs that I mentioned, which also brings together people. They have a conference usually here in Washington in collaboration between AAAS and the National Academies, provide an opportunity for younger people to explore this field, get into it if they're interested, and some of them do. We at AAAS have hired on our staff several people who've been graduates of this program, master's degree graduates from this program, and some have been highly successful and are really leaders, young leaders in the field. So I'm an advocate for this kind of education, and I think we're doing it, and I think it would be useful for Congress, for members of Congress, if they were aware of this, to provide, I would say, moral support by speaking at their meetings and having staff attend and so on. So I'll leave it at that.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Teich. And I had when we were going out for votes, I was getting in an elevator, and someone who had been sitting in the audience came up and thanked me for having this the hearing on SciSip, and said, how do members really become educated? How do you have the time? And I said it's very, very difficult, and what it really takes is a dedication to, being educated, because the incentives, other than really wanting to do a good job and being interested in this topic, aren't there. It's unfortunate, but the good thing is that we do have staff who are well educated in these things, and it leads me into thanking the staff for all their work that you do, and all the staff on the Science Committee does an excellent job, so that helps us to do a better job here, hopefully, on the Science and Technology Committee, help the members do a better job. So I thank the staff for all the work that they do. With that, I want to thank the witnesses for their testimony. The record remain open for 2 weeks for additional statements from the members and for answers to any follow-up questions the committee may ask of the witnesses. With that, the witnesses are excused and the hearing is now adjourned.
Seeing you then on the, I'll make sure that I know. Good to see you.